I'd like to welcome everyone back. I hope everyone had an interesting and insightful discussion within the separate breakout rooms and within the separate panels. So to sum up some of the main points from the separate panels, I'm just going to go through some of the key issues. Then we will continue with the program of the conference. So beginning with digital entrepreneurship, all of our speakers agreed that digitalization is a challenge to most businesses, but it is also an opportunity since there is a lot more business and activities going on the internet than ever before. This could be attributed to COVID-19. It was definitely a key factor, and it primarily showed that change is possible and that it is possible to quickly change how and in what way you conduct not only business, but your everyday lives. They also touched on some more local aspects. For instance, the smallness of Slovenia could be a negative factor, but it could also be an opportunity or a benefit, with the example of Estonia. They elaborated and showed some good examples of NFT and cryptocurrencies and their effects on basically the business world. And they touched upon both on digital marketing, how physical activities and the digital activities can coexist and be intertwined, both work in the favor of companies and organizations. Those are just some key points. Of course, all of these panels, individual panels, will be published on our YouTube page or on our Facebook page. I'm not completely sure, but they will be published. So if anyone will be interested in seeing some content from these panels, they can watch them after our conference. The next panel that I want to touch on is the impact of digitalization on the environment. Throughout their conversation and debate, they agreed that the biggest environmental challenge is that the environment doesn't affect the pockets of us as individuals and businesses enough to have a big impact on how we conduct not only business but our day-to-day lives as well. Another important topic that they touched on is how important going green is and how important it is to talk about this topic, encourage this discussion about this topic, and especially educate people about this topic, not only on an individual level, but as businessmen as well. They emphasize that the younger generations are much more prone and concentrated on the aspect of green and sustainability, which is a good outlook for the future, basically. And they elaborated that one of the core issues is that the general population do not understand the publicly available data about sustainability. And they also touched upon the fact that when it comes to green, sustainable, and everything connected with this concept, there is a similar issue or approach that has to be addressed holistically. The core message being that culture is key. You need culture to change and implement digitalization factors, and you need the culture to change in order to implement some environmental changes. So moving forward to the panel about EU grants and digital development, they gave us some insight into the main guidelines for future tenders, which are resilience, green, and digitalization. There will be different tenders for basically two types of projects based on the stage of development of different ideas. So for instance, from ideas to prototype and from prototype to market, these will be some subjects which will be publicly funded in the future. They outlined some key projects such as Project Digital Europe, EIC Accelerator 2020, and EIC Pathfinder 2020, and had a constructive and interesting discussion about this topic in general. Moving forward to EU funds for municipalities, BSc Kranj developed and declared a program that strengthens the Gorinska regional cooperation. They mentioned that the main field of operation for them are multi-million international development projects. They conducted over 100 projects in 1995. They're currently implementing over 40 projects, which basically makes them the most active and impactful regional agency in Slovenia. They gave us some more insight into how they work, how they function, and gave some insight into the opportunities for EU funding for municipalities and other structures that fall in this field. And lastly, the last panel or topic of discussion was the mental health panel, which touched on the primary negative aspects of mental digitalization on mental health. And they emphasized that these issues affect the young population the most, due to the fact that the young population is most exposed to digitalization and some of these factors, but that it both directly and indirectly affects other demographics as well. So that was a short summary of what we discussed, what we talked about, and the topics that were in effect during our separate panel discussions. Now I'd like to start with the closing panel, the title of which, let me just share my screen again, the title of which is Digitalization and Demographics. Joining us will be the New York Times featured author and CEO of the Super Age, Bradley Schurman. But before inviting him to the digital stage, I'll say a few introductory words. So I want to shed some light on some key issues regarding digitalization and demographics. We outlined basically 6 core issues. So unequal degree of adoption, the digital divide in employment and culture, the greater degree of inequality, lower intergenerational cohesion and understandings, gaps between the developed and developing world, negative influences on mental health of individuals and on society. We will touch on these topics, of course, in connection with what the panel discussions were today, and also some other factors connected to the digitalization. But of course, there cannot be issues with opportunities, which we also outlined 6 core opportunities. There are many opportunities in elderly care and hospitality, widespread connectivity, more free time and leisure, cooperation and teamwork, preserving traditions, and a longer lifespan and more fulfilling lives of citizens. Now, that's it basically for the introductory words. Now I'd like to say a few words about Bradley Schurman. As I mentioned before, he's the founder and CEO of the Super Age, and this is basically a research and advisory firm specializing in helping organizations understand the challenge and harness the opportunities of demographic change with a focus on population aging. He's also the author of Super Age. Schurman was the co-founder and managing partner of Economy 4, where he led business development in Asia and Europe. Schurman has been instrumental in securing the topics of aging and longevity as focus areas at both the Economic Forum and Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development. He was also responsible for being the visionary and executing the Aging Readiness and Competitiveness Report, a groundbreaking collaborative research between AARP and Foreign Policy Group. Schurman has been featured on NBC Today show and quoted in the New York Times, Huffington Post, and USA Today, as well as in the local and national media outlets around the world. He speaks regularly at thought leader forums around the world and has advised national governments and major businesses on their longevity strategies. So now, without further ado, I'd like to welcome Bradley Schurman and just check if all the digital requirements are working.
It looks like it is.
It looks like it is. Okay, so at least once today, everything is working as it's supposed to, right?
Well, it had to for one of the final panels, right?
Exactly. I'm joking.
It's good to see you this morning.
Yeah.
This afternoon in your time zone, of course.
Yeah, after it's 2 p.m. here, so it's a sunny afternoon in Ljubljana.
It's quite gray and depressing here in Washington.
Okay, so that's a change because usually in Ljubljana it's gray.
I know.
I guess our conference shed some sunlight on the podcast.
I sent all of our good weather over to you. It's my gift since I can't be there in person.
Perfect, thank you. So maybe do you have some introductory words based on what I talked about, what was discussed in the panels, maybe some key trends or issues that you want to emphasize? Or
Sure. I think the first and foremost thing to highlight today is that you're hitting all of the right notes about what's happening within society today as it revolves around digital transformation. Perhaps the one piece that is overarching, and in fact, I think why IPM and the US State Department asked me to join you today, was this question of demographics and how colliding megatrends of decreased birth rates and increased longevity are working together to create a vastly older and generationally diverse population than ever before. As most of you probably know already, Slovenia is on the front end of this, being one of the first nations in the world to have a population where 1 out of 5 people will be over the age of 65. The United States is not too far behind, but there are a number of other countries in front of us, including places like Japan and Germany, where we can learn a lot about how they're managing their larger societies and economies, but also finding inspiration in how their marketplaces are managing digital transformation for their larger citizenry. So as we move through this conversation this afternoon, I'd obviously like it to be as interactive as possible. We'll be asking a lot of questions between myself and the moderator, but also when we get to some Q&A, maybe from the audience as well, we can talk about some very specific things, some specific innovations and how they may be applicable to Slovenia. If there's one thing I'd like to mention today is that I get really excited about a place like Slovenia because of its size, not in spite of its size. And I want to make sure that that's underlined, highlighted, bolded, and flashing lights, because the tightness, the compactness of Slovenia, the divide between rural and urban, offers you a unique chance in a relatively small geographic space to test a lot of really big ideas that could be transferred to larger markets like those across Europe and even the United States or China. This is a really interesting time to be engaging in the digital space, especially as a super-aged nation, because you can test out how the digital transformation is really being engaged by older populations. The older populations that are in retirement now or in later life barely touched Web 1.0. They may have email, they may have had a computer at one time, but the generations that are coming into retirement now in later life have likely all been through that transformation, and many of them are engaged in Web 2.0. The one piece that I'd like to highlight as well as we talk today is that technology always evolves. So as we head into Web 3.0, those of you who are on this webinar today who might be Gen X or millennials or even Gen Z, Web 3.0 might be new to you. You'll be an immigrant to this new digital space. You won't be a native. So as we think about what this digital transformation means, take off your hat of your generation that you sit in right today. Don't focus on the fact of othering older populations. Think about who you are right here and right now and what you think you might need for the future.
Okay, Bradley, perfect. A great intro, I think, into our discussion today. Maybe before I start with the questions and the discussion itself, I wanted to emphasize or maybe outline the point you made. So that Slovenia is a perfect testing ground for innovations, products, services, whatever, due to its small size and relative difference between both demographics, regions, and the city and the rural area, basically. And what's interesting is that within IPM Group, we have a company. So one of those is IPM Digital, which is working on this conference today. But another one, which I am basically the chief operating officer at, and I'm really involved in it, IPM Tech Hub, offers exactly this. It helps foreign innovative companies test and start their products in Slovenia. Not only because of the benefits you mentioned, but also Slovenia is somewhat, in some ways, similar to the market of the Western Balkans. And it's a perfect starting point to begin your operations and then expand into the Western Balkans. So I just wanted to elaborate a bit on that point. And it's so interesting to me that basically we were thinking of that and working in this field. And now, without even mentioning it, we came to this topic without even any connection to IPM Tech Hub, basically.
Well, I think it's important for the audience to note today too, that the digital transformation and this gap between generations, that exists worldwide. So where there won't necessarily be a one-size-fits-all solution that's developed in Slovenia, a lot of the learnings that can happen there, as well as the learnings that you can glean from other countries and other economies, might actually be really applicable for the future, because we're all struggling with this right now. How to make sure older populations are up-teched, have that digital literacy, but also remain as closely connected to us as humanly possible. Now, I'll say one thing. The pandemic has been terrible for so many reasons, but one upside of the pandemic is that it has pushed forward a lot of digital transformation. And we're just starting to understand how far we've moved forward. And because of that, I'd like everyone who's participating today to really pay attention to what happened in the past 2 years. Really take note of what worked and what didn't. That's what we're doing here right now in the US, trying to assess, trying to make a clear understanding of how much did we actually move forward in 2 years. I think it's fair to say that 2 years ago, we wouldn't have had the technology in place to really do this in a meaningful way, nor would we want to sit in a digital space and engage in a conference either. So just this alone, just this experience today shows us what the future could be.
Yes, exactly. And it's interesting how, for instance, 2 years ago, people wouldn't even imagine about attending a video conference or an online conference. But now, according to the trends and what we see as organizers of such events, people actually prefer a hybrid mode or a completely online mode for online events. For instance, sorry, go ahead.
No, exactly. And it's almost like we're living in the future because it has happened so quickly. But if we allow ourselves to take stock of what's actually changed, much of it has been for the better in terms of our ability to find efficiencies, build connectivity, not only within our countries, but around the world. I've met more people engaged in more projects during the pandemic than ever in my life. So I look at the technological transformation, at least, as a net positive. We also saw during the pandemic, at least in the US, that a number of older populations that had been resistant to taking on digital technologies did so in great force, whether it was for work or for living at home, having groceries delivered, getting transportation to and from the hospital, finding a vaccine. All of these things forced people into this new digital world.
Yeah, exactly. I agree. And for instance, my first-hand experience, we used to spend a whole day for 2 meetings, because you had to drive an hour and a half or 2 hours to some location, have a meeting, and then go back. A meeting that potentially wouldn't bring anything because it's just a meeting, right? Now exactly. I can do 10 meetings in a matter of 5 hours if they're efficient, without even moving from my desk at the office. So there are a lot of upsides, right?
Exactly. And there's a balancing act here too, because we don't want to lose the human part of interaction. And that's one of the great fears of the digital era that lines up with the super age, is that we're going to have a lot more older people that may need a lot more care, especially those people that are at the very end of life, while we're having fewer kids. So we will not be able to deliver the same hand-to-hand care that we deliver today in the future, perhaps 10, 15, or 20 years out. So we need to find ways to leverage technology, whether it be simple technology like this over webcam to deliver care within the home, or perhaps futuristic technologies like robots or automation, or even Web3 and virtual spaces to deliver care in the future. But like I said, places like Japan can offer us a great sense of inspiration about what the future can be, but they can also offer a cautionary tale of what not to do, or perhaps the pitfalls that are ahead of us in this digital and demographic transition. And I mention that because just a few years ago, before the pandemic, I was in Japan and traveled through the country visiting the nursing centers, which are under great stress right now because nearly a third of their population is over 65. Quite shocking. And I found that the nursing homes that felt like they were delivering the best care, even though the metrics weren't necessarily clear, were the ones that still had a very human touch. The residents, the patients felt happier. They expressed gratitude for their care workers. In the institutions or the homes that engaged in high technology, there seemed to be a disconnect between the happiness of the workers and the efficiency, or happiness of the residents rather, and the workers and the efficiencies of the system. So during this transformation, don't necessarily assume that digital technology can solve for everything. It can solve for many things, but what makes us human is still an integral part of the solution.
Yes, I agree. I think it's important to look at digitalization as a joint process. So we have to find a way to connect the digital and the physical, because that's the only way that it will basically work. And not only that it will work, but that it will bring us a greater benefit, not just as businesses, but as individuals, as a society as a whole. Joining together digital and physical, I think, is what the future holds basically for us.
Absolutely. And it's important to note too that this extends past older populations. Let me be very clear about that. Because we're in a period where birth rates continue to decline, we're going to need to find efficiencies within our systems in order for our economies to continue to grow, because our markets will eventually contract. So to give everyone sense of the world today, we're around 8 billion people and counting. But sometime this century, when most of us will be alive, the global population will actually plateau. It will stop at 10 billion people. So we have a great period to take advantage of new markets. But once we get to that point of 10 billion, we can anticipate that there will be a plateauing. And in fact, many countries, almost all in Europe, perhaps even the United States, certainly Japan and Korea and China, will have already started population decline, in fact, a contracting of their populations. So finding efficiencies through digital technologies are a great way for us to keep our economic pole position in the global economy.
Yeah, I completely agree with that standpoint, and it kind of connects with something I wanted to discuss and talk about. So you mentioned earlier that there is a gap between the demographics, like the older generation is not particularly skillful or has some deficiencies when it comes to the digital environment. But you also mentioned that younger generations will be faced with another shift as well. Maybe you could elaborate both on the skill gap between
Sure.
digital environment and this new topic that will hit us all as the younger generation.
So I think everyone knows what this is. This is an iPhone. In the next few months, the iPhone will celebrate its 15th birthday. 15 years ago, true smartphones like the iPhone were introduced to the world. Today, 8 out of 10 people worldwide has a smartphone. That's remarkable. Thinking about other transformative technologies that we've engaged in over human history, one that we all have in our homes is the refrigerator. The refrigerator took 50 years to reach mass adoption. So the timeline of adoption is actually collapsing quite quickly. And that's something to be really excited about, because it means more and more people are getting on board in a faster and more meaningful way that can really transform the world in which we live in today. That being said, there is a consistent theme that older populations, and when I say older, I want to be clear here, that's not a universal number of 65 plus, 75 plus, 85 plus. It's a general statement. Older populations, particularly those people who leave work, see their technological skills dip when they leave the office place. That is fact. In the future, because of our shrinking populations, because we'll need more workers, I anticipate that a lot more older people, people past the traditional retirement age, will want to remain in the workplace. In fact, we're seeing it here in the United States already. In order to do that, though, businesses will need to make continual investments, both business and government, continual investments in upskilling their workers on digital technologies. Because time and time again, when we look at what are the main problems facing employers, it's that the different generations in the workplace don't talk to each other the same way. Older generations tend to like things like the telephone, email, in-person conversations as a general rule. Younger generations, you can't pull them away from their mobile device. So if a business really wants to take advantage of this change and build a generationally diverse workforce, then they really need to make investments so that everyone on staff has access and literacy to the same technologies. For those oldest old, it's a different question. It's a different question because it's based on need. People won't use technologies unless they believe they need those technologies. And I think that that's a primary learning that we've come away with from the pandemic, is that older populations, those ones who were most resistant to digitization, did not take up those technologies until they were forced to, until they needed groceries delivered into their home, or they wanted to communicate with their families. Or, surprise, surprise, most vaccine access was given through digital platforms too. So if they wanted the vaccine to protect them against the virus, which killed them at a higher rate, they needed to figure out the computer quite quickly. Fortunately, most families are diverse in terms of their digital literacy. So most of these older populations had at least family members that could help skill them in using these technologies. In fact, one of the takeaways from the pandemic is that families, family caregivers in particular, began cobbling together, putting together different services from grocery delivery to house cleaning to doctor's visits, et cetera, all through digital platforms. So it engaged their older relatives in a more meaningful way. And these older relatives, these older family members, were able to greater understand what digital technology could actually do for them.
So in a way, basically, we could say that there's a support system that needs to be in place. The younger generation, as the younger generation learned to do basic things from the older generation, now it's kind of switching in a way. And
it goes both ways.
It goes both ways, of course.
And that's actually the way it used to be.
Yeah,
we spent, for some reason, following the Second World War, in large part because we had an extreme explosion of population, we started moving older people out of the workforce and sidelining them from society. We put them into retirement, either through the public pension system or private savings vehicles, encouraging them to live this kind of active and fit retirement lifestyle that didn't exist for most people at the end of the day. We didn't give them the tools to stay connected as part of us, part of who we are. When I entered the workforce in the 1990s, we actually were at our lowest workforce participation rate for people over the age of 65 in the United States, which was around 14%, incredibly low. But we've had higher periods of labor force participation rate of older workers in the past. In fact, just following the Second World War, before the boomers actually became adults, labor force participation rates for older workers, people over the age of 65, was nearing 50%. So because of our shifting demographics, we're going to need to have more older people in the workforce. They're going to be able to impart their skills and their wisdom to younger generations through mentoring programs downward, but younger generations will able to bring that mentoring back, like you mentioned, with new skills, new technologies, and take it to older populations within the workforce, whether that be management or the C-suite. In fact, we've already seen this happen. We've seen this happen at big companies across Europe, in the United States. One company who's actually very small in Germany, the Brammertz Carpentry, which is only probably 40 or 50 people that work there, hired a man who was in his 80s as a master carpenter. And he was paired with the apprentices. And he taught the apprentices the old world techniques of caring for wood, shaping wood into the shapes that Brammertz was known for, the high quality product. And in turn, the younger generations, with all of these new digital skills that they had learned from the trade schools, were able to bring those into Brammertz, teach the oldest worker, Jakob, and he learned a whole new thing, whole new way of doing business. So it was an exciting experiment for them. And it can be done on scale too. In fact, some of the largest employers in Europe, BMW, Porsche, ThyssenKrupp, all German companies, have been very active in how they are engaging older and younger populations together in the workplace. It's really a model for the future.
The topic you're currently discussing is exactly what I wanted to ask or discuss with you, basically. So yes, there are some examples of this working, and there are, of course, domestic examples when people do it at home, when this support system is in place. Do you think there is kind of a blueprint or the most efficient way of implementing not only education about new digital technologies, but what would be the blueprint for a company to encourage co-working of a diverse group of demographically diverse group of workers and individuals?
Right. So I actually think this gets a bit into the futurism piece. So it may sound a bit strange to people, especially Europeans, quite frankly. I think the future of work looks a lot like the gig economy, for better or for worse. I think that the American model of working a couple of different jobs isn't that unusual. In fact, I think it may be the thing that we do in the near future. We all become our own mini companies in some way, because we're able to do it. We're able to do it because of technology. We're able to manage our schedules better because of technology. In fact, I've used an AI scheduler now for 2 years. It's far more efficient than a human could be, and it allows me to be in more places than one at times, and that's exciting. As it relates to traditional workplaces, I think that technology will actually help us better understand what individuals need. Right now, many workplaces are a one-size-fits-all. We have one salary structure, we have one benefit structure. And depending on who you are within the company, most people get the same amount of sick leave, the same amount of retirement leave, the same amount of vacation leave, rather. But the reality is, we're not all built the same. I'm a single gay man. I work like a dog. And 60 to 80 hours a week is not unusual for me. I don't have any caregiving responsibilities because I have no children. My parents are still quite healthy, so I like to work. So things like caregiving leave or extra vacation don't necessarily appeal to me. They aren't something that I'd like in my compensation package, but extra money sure is. For other people who might be primary caregivers for children or parents, they may need more time off. So technology, I think, can come in to assess skills against needs. So think of it as almost dynamic compensation and benefits packages. I think that's something that can come into full effect. But as it relates to the workforce of the future, I think there's a new business case, as I call it. So because we have contracting labor markets, businesses will have to compete in ways that they never have before, certainly in anyone's lifetime who's in the employment space, for new talent. And that new talent can be really young, coming out of school, or really old, might be thinking about coming out of retirement, or perhaps not leaving the workforce at all. But in order to do that, we really have to tackle some digital problems. Many of the software that recruits, that sifts through resumes, is designed by young people in mind, and designed only with young people in mind. So the language is wrong. The way it sorts is wrong. The fact that we ask people for their number of years of experience is wrong. There's a lot of bad metrics that we put into digital sorting that we probably should throw out today. The second piece, and again, where digital technologies are really important, is because of our shrinking workforce sizes, we're going to need to find ways to augment individuals with technology. Like I said, I use an AI scheduler. I automate some of my work wherever it's possible. We'll have to do that with more and more employees going forward if we want to maintain the efficiencies in the system. Do not replace workers with technology, but find ways that technology that can help them move forward. We'll want to support workers by giving them new skills, caregiving leave and flexibility. Flexibility is one of those pieces now that's universal. So again, dynamic work in the near future will become something a lot more common than it is today. And the final piece, E, CASE, E is extending working lives through improved ergonomics. Again, that helps you extend the working lives, and continual education at work. We got lucky, or at least fortunate enough to have so many workers for so many decades that we forgot that workers were assets. Well, now that we've had this contraction, and this contraction will continue for the foreseeable future, we have to think of workers now more like assets. How do you keep your assets working, running efficiently, and doing the best job they can? And as we, have a 5-generation workplace in effect right now, perhaps 6 generations in the future, we'll have to make sure that we're communicating well in the workplace too.
Okay, an interesting insight. I wanted to touch on something you said. So basically, in other words, we are moving to a more individualistic, basically, how do you say, reimbursement package or benefits package for individual employees based on their needs and wants and aspirations. But with this in mind, how do you think, or do you believe that the issue of inequality, or the perception of individuals, if they will be comparing what someone gets and what another person gets, how would you solve this issue? I mean, do you have any? It's a complex issue, of course.
It is, and fortunately, I'm not a public servant, so I don't have to answer that question. But I do believe that there is a question of equity across the board. There's a question of inclusion across the board. But I also think that there are certain demands in the marketplace that will make the system ripe for this type of change. I think what we see is that certainly with parents, forget their age, young or old, it doesn't matter. With parents, there's a good chunk of the day that sits idle. I know a number of mothers in particular who are really busy from 6 a.m. till 9 a.m. getting their kids up and ready for school, and then from 9 a.m. until 3 a.m. they're idle, and then from 4 until bedtime they're working with the children again. And many of them are interested, at least anecdotally, are interested in doing some type of work. They should be able to find ways to get that engagement in a formal office setting if they so choose. But make no mistake, the gig economy is growing. The big problem with the gig economy today is compensation, as you mentioned. Are people being paid fairly for the work that they're doing? The second piece is saving appropriately for retirement. Obviously, the American system is quite different than European systems. So when we save for retirement, the portion of our earnings comes directly out of our check into the government coffers, but we also have to put money aside too in 401k, private savings vehicles that go into the marketplace. Gig workers aren't required to do that. And that's a problem because people have a harder time planning. So I'd say at least we should be requiring that some amount of their earnings are going into a savings vehicle. And And the third piece, a very important point here, there is that digital skills gap, but there is a lag in access too. And I think we really saw that here in the United States, at least during the pandemic, is that lower income populations in urban areas, as well as populations in rural areas, just don't have the same level of access to technology, but more importantly, to those high-speed networks who are wealthier in urban areas have great access to today. And because of that, those folks are left behind. And like all things, if you don't create an equitable or an inclusive environment, falling behind has a multiplier effect over time. A good friend of mine would often say, he was actually the communications director for a presidential candidate a number of years ago, big on social media. And he would always say, if you miss one transition on social media, from Facebook to Twitter, Twitter to Instagram, Instagram to TikTok, you will never catch up. And while I don't fully believe that assessment, there's a lot about it that rings true when it relates to digital access. Younger populations are doing really well today with technologies. If we don't make those investments for the future, they'll likely fall behind other countries around the world.
Yeah, I agree with the standpoint that it's hard to give equality, especially when it comes to different demographics, areas, accesses, and of course, finance is a big issue here. That's why I wanted to ask you and basically ask your perspective on how do you tackle this issue?
Well,
I know this is a broad question,
it's a good question though, and it's an important question. And I think one of the ways that we have to tackle it is to decide as a nation or an economy whether or not we believe that digital literacy is as important as traditional literacy. I think it's unfathomable for most people to think that there could be large numbers of illiterate people within our populations, people who can't actually read a book or read an advertisement. That seems so barbaric. But it wasn't that long ago that was commonplace. Let's not forget that. Our economies made significant investments to ensure that the children were educated, they learned how to read. In fact, we've even made investments for adult populations to ensure that they know how to read. So when it comes to the digital transformation, I think the question is quite clear. Do we believe that all people within our countries should have equal access to digital technologies? And do we believe that they should be literate on those technologies? And I think it's a very simple question. And once we've answered that question, and I believe it's yes to both, by the way, I think once we've answered those questions, then we have to figure out how to fund it. And whether it's done exclusively through the public sector, through government and schools, or is it something that we do through the private sector? Or can we be creative and find a hybrid model? In fact, I've been really amazed to see some financial institutions stepping into this conversation around financial literacy because they have a business need to do it. In fact, one business in particular is the British bank Barclays. Barclays has a program in which it uses its existing infrastructure of bank branches, and they open them at night, and they invite people who are not digitally literate into these bank branches, and they teach them how to use a computer, a tablet, a mobile phone. Of course, they teach them how to do online banking because that's the end goal at the end of the day for Barclays. But they also teach them how to add an attachment to an email, send a photo to a friend, text perhaps for the first time ever. So while there may be very selfish motivations here by a company like Barclays, the end result is actually quite transformative.
Yes, interesting. This kind of connects to, so basically, if we are going to wait for an institutional change that will bring education and digital literacy both to the younger population and to the older population, because digital literacy is not something as knowing how to read, because it's not something you learn once and then you know it. It's a completely live animal. It constantly changes. Maybe you're right. Maybe the solution is actually to find ways of private companies packaging this education within their services in a way that it would make it both profitable for them and educational for the buyers, the individuals, right?
Well, yeah, of course. And let me give you a very personal example here. You know, I grew up in a very well-to-do community outside of Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, where we had access to basically everything we could ever want. I had a computer in my home when I was 8 years old. I'm 44 today, just in case anyone needed to know. That was unusual at the time, but what was strange is that the school system had a lag because there wasn't that immediate public investment and consideration that people should all know digital skills. So I still remember entering high school and seeing that there were still typewriters in the high school classrooms, because they still were teaching students up until that year to learn how to type on a physical typewriter versus a computer. So there is always going to be a lag between what private sector innovation does and what public sector support can do. But the two always go hand in hand. I mean, they are partners in this. And not to get too rah-rah America on this, but when America really works well, when transformation really happens here, government tends to be the funder and private sector tends to be the innovator. Government puts on those guardrails, but gives innovation that opportunity to play in a pretty sizable sandbox for long periods of time. And that's a model I think actually applies well throughout the world. But don't wait around assuming that government is just going to come around. Governments are struggling with a number of different major issues today. Obviously, in the past few weeks, most government's attention has been pulled towards Ukraine. Digital literacy is low on their list of things to do today, even though it's an important one.
Yeah, I agree. And it's interesting how a phenomenon such as COVID-19, for instance, as we discussed earlier, has sped up this process, not only in the public sector, and I mean, not only in the private sector, because companies had to adapt, of course, but in the public sector as well, right?
Yeah, case in point, I spent Christmas in Italy this year, and 2 weeks before departure, the president changed the re-entry requirements for COVID testing. And my family was returning the day after Christmas. Nothing's open in Italy on Christmas. I don't think there's even emergency rooms open on Christmas Day in Italy. But we were able to, because of technology developed by Abbott Labs, to swab and do our own test within our own property with a virtual proctor, and it was taken care of in 15 minutes. That's revolutionary. And when you think about time alone on that would have taken 2, 3, maybe 4 hours to get done in a regular world. But in our digital world, it was incredible efficiency, 15 minutes total to get it all done.
Yeah. I didn't even know that was possible, what you explained now. So I guess I'm learning as well.
Well, but I think that's the point. It's like government can get in the way, or government can get out of the way, or government can find some kind of middle ground where they're actively engaged and supporting transformation. What we see is, I think personally, what I see and my team sees as one of the best things that our government is investing in right now is digital infrastructure. And making sure that the nation has access to a proper 5G network that will transform communities across the country. And we need to think, governments in particular and public sector leaders really need to understand that digital infrastructure is no different than roads and bridges. In many cases, it's the same, if not more important, as more and more people are working from home or working in virtual spaces.
Yes, I guess that as you said, common ground is key here when it comes to governmental inclusion in aspects such as the digitalization. Now, maybe if we connect, so the big thing when it comes to the COVID-19 pandemic was moving everything to digital, finding new ways to adapt, etc., etc. What is, in your opinion, the next big thing, the next big trend, the next big change?
I mean, I think immersive environments are our next big leap forward. You know, I would say that Oculus and the headsets right now are akin to dial-up modems in the 1990s. They're slow. They're you know, they're not quite where they need to be yet, but they are a dramatic step forward. And when people look at them, they say, "Ooh, this is amazing." Think about what could be 5 years out from now, where we actually have truly immersive spaces that you can step into, perhaps without a headset on. I certainly think that for care delivery in particular, this immersive environment is going to be essential for finding efficiencies in the healthcare system, but also improving the way in which care is delivered to the marketplace. I think just about emergency care. Each municipality does it differently in this country. But here in Washington, when there's an emergency call, the fire department shows up, the ambulance shows up, and the police show up. Well, that's easily at least 7 people, if not a full dozen. That's a lot of human capital to show up for an emergency visit. Meanwhile, in a virtual space, if somebody is in duress, an assessment can be made quite quickly if that full cadre of people are needed to show up at a single site. It would be amazing if we could do a quick triage virtually. And I think that's something that we'll be looking for as a possibility in the future. I also believe that technologies will help people live at home for longer periods of time as well, both within Web 3, but also Web 2. Like I mentioned earlier, individuals are already cobbling together what we call IADLs, or assistance with daily living tasks. All of you are cobbling together IADLs today, instruments of assisted daily living. You call Ubers, some of you have your groceries delivered, you're speaking to your devices at home, whether it be Amazon or Google. You're already doing these things. You're already bringing in these services. I even have prescriptions delivered now from my pharmacy. All of that stuff can be delivered within the home because of technology. So in the future, will people like me and like you need to go into assisted living or nursing care at a higher or faster pace than in previous generations? I think the answer is a resounding no. Also, we know that these technologies, whether it be those connected devices like Amazon or Google, or even just talking to people over Zoom, helps alleviate significant degrees of loneliness, which is one of the big fears that people have had with individuals staying home for longer periods of time. So with all of that in mind, I actually see a future that looks quite positive if people are willing enough to embrace technology. And I think that certainly it appears that generations that are on this call today, since we're all actively working, that that we're going to be the ones who really take this transformation forward. We're going to push against the norm of moving out of our homes. We're going to focus on finding ways to allow digital platforms to deliver the things that we need in the home in the future.
Okay, so what I wanted to you emphasized some great positive aspects of Web 3.0, right? And what are, in your opinion, some negative aspects or some possibilities of negative externalities that could happen, just so that we have a balanced pluses and minuses conversation?
No. I mean, I'm very bullish on the future, and I'm very positive about the future. But like any transformation, we have to pay attention to the problems. I certainly think that we don't fully understand right now how digital technologies fully transform the brain, how addictive they are, and what those addictive tendencies can mean. for the population long term. I think this is very important for children right now, certainly as they engage in a virtual world and an analog world, and those two spaces are blurring. Bullying is up, eating disorders are up, body dysmorphia issues are up amongst younger populations. Older populations, they don't have the same kind of challenges because they're able to separate the two. They see analog and digital as very different, very separate. The virtual space could exacerbate or make worse these issues for younger populations. So that's something I think we need to be aware of. And again, where government can come in is monitoring these technology companies, these digital companies that are putting out these environments, these metaverses for our populations to engage in, and really consider, what the long-term or even short-term health effects are on the population. That's an important thing to watch. The second thing that I think is vastly important that we pay attention to today and tomorrow is that privacy is managed whenever possible. I think people have, in many ways, forgotten what privacy is because of digital space. In fact, it's interesting speaking with people in government and even analog business, how much they struggle getting the right kind of data out of people. But on digital platforms, they have no problem with people handing over their name, their age, their weight, the types of clothes they like to buy, the cars that they enjoy, their social security or government identification numbers, their dietary preferences. We give more of our information to business than we do to our own governments, and we don't know how they're using it. So I think some protections on the consumer at the end of the day are something that I'd really like to see more digital businesses speaking up for. And the third cautionary tale is getting to that earlier point about equity, whether it's equity amongst income groups or geographic groups or racial groups or gendered groups. We really need to make sure that the investments in digital literacy happen early, that they're as close to equal as possible early on in life, both for access and literacy, and that we encourage companies, either through direct investment, through government funding or loans, to continue educating people throughout their lives. Because those deficiencies in the system, again, they pay for themselves if we make those critical investments up front.
Okay, really interesting standpoint, especially the one about privacy and this whole aspect. Now,
well, I would say just one thing on that privacy piece in particular. Within privacy, we also have to put some guardrails on for fraud protection. Through, I think, no fault of their own, older populations tend to be more trustworthy. It's unclear whether or not that will continue once we get out of the digital immigrant stage, the people that are the oldest old now and digital natives come in, people like me and perhaps most of you come into older age. We're a bit more critical about what we read. We know the sources that are really valid. We're better at figuring out fake news. Younger generations seem to be even better than that than us. But I'm concerned about the future and the manipulation of data as it relates to fraud, both in terms of stealing from people, which is of course a major issue. In fact, most people who are victims of fraud now, I think, lose on average about $120,000 if they're a victim of fraud, which is quite sizable. But also being victims of fraud as it relates to misinformation. And we're seeing misinformation in real time coming out of Russia today. We saw misinformation proliferate here in the United States during both the 2016 and the 2020 election. So we have to be careful about this, because if things like that get even further out of line, become more normalized, then our liberal democracies are threatened.
Exactly. It's getting harder and harder to know what's real and what's fake, basically. With all of these innovations, it's going to be also much easier to fake things, fake videos, fake statements, fake pictures, etc., etc. So at the end of the day, it starts and stops at digital literacy. If you are literate digitally, you're going to have a bit more of an advantage compared to someone who isn't, with identifying these red flags of what's not okay with some news or some video that you saw online, basically, especially if this is going to be something you will see in a virtual world.
Right. And it comes back to the question of, where do we start? We have a saying, the chicken or the egg. Where do you start here? Well, the circle's already going. The wheel is already turning. At some point, an intervention needs to come in. Either government or private sector needs to come in and say, we've got to break this cycle, because misinformation is so bad now, and it's going to continue to get worse because the technology is going to continue to improve, that if we don't make critical investments, we're potentially threatening our own futures.
Exactly. If I'm not mistaken, time is a little bit not on our side. It was a great conversation. Maybe now, before we conclude, I would like to ask the public if anyone has any questions, they can write them up in chat, and we'll ask Mr. Schurman to answer one or two questions before finishing up with today's conference.
Mr. Schurman's my father.
Mr. Schurman.
So
okay.
Just Brad is mine.
Okay, we'll give a minute or two to anyone if anybody wants to ask anything. The thing that's interesting while we wait, for instance, the main difference between, for instance, Slovenian universities and American universities is that people in America keep asking questions. Well, in Slovenia, usually when you have this situation, especially now when everything was online, the professors asked, does anyone have any questions? And it was just silent and no pictures on the cameras.
Yeah.
Okay, so we have one question. How to centralize decentralization?
Ooh, that's a big question. Let's start with an easy one. How do you centralize decentralization? So obviously regulation is a path to this. Government at the beginning of any transformative period really needs to offer industry a sandbox, a place where they can play and figure out what works and what doesn't. But as industry begins to evolve, government's role really needs to be to put some guardrails on it that protect the consumer at the end of the day. And over the course of the life cycle of a business or an industry, these regulations kind of push and pull depending on how the rest of society, the rest of economy is evolving. So one of the obviously the places that we're talking about today, but obviously one that's first and foremost in the front of people's minds in the US is digital technologies and social media. And these industries virtually have no guardrails on them right now by the government. There are no guidelines for false information. There are no speech protections on these platforms. Speech is governed by the business itself versus what is allowed in a public domain. So that's led to some confusion about what is and what isn't allowed by the general populace. Obviously, in order to create and to encourage a free market where business can actually innovate, you'd like to be as light on regulation as possible, light on centralization as possible, and heavier on decentralization. But we do need some basic nodes of agreement of what works in order for the whole thing to work. So it probably sounds like I'm dancing around this. I'm not trying to do that. I think about some examples that we can probably lean into from history. And one that comes to mind, in part because I'm such a fan of the era, in part because there's a television show that talks about it right now, is the Gilded Age. And the Gilded Age talks about, in large part, the booming railroad industry at the time. We have a very strange gauge for American trains here, a very odd measure. But there was an agreement that this was the measure, even though we had dozens, if not more than 100, different railway systems operating across this nation. Government and business agreed to those standards, so the larger system, the nationwide system, could actually work at the end of the day. The internet is a place that is governed by a central node, essentially, but there is great decentralization in terms of who owns what in terms of governing their own little space. I'd like to think that places like Facebook and Instagram and TikTok, they're their own mini metaverses already. They govern the space that they're in, but they don't necessarily own it. The internet is owned by something else. So it's a hard way to get to a very big question. So I'm sorry if I didn't get to it specifically. If you have maybe a little bit more tailoring, I could probably go a bit deeper.
I think that was a broad question, so it's entitled to a broad answer. I think you answered it really great.
Good.
So with that, I'd like to end today's conference. I'd like to thank you for your time, for a delightful and interesting, insightful conversation. So thank you, Bradley, very much.
Thank you so much for having me today, and we're thinking about you over here. Have a good rest of your week.
Thank you. So now I'd like to give a special thanks to the US Embassy for making this project possible. I'd like to thank all of our partners, Tiko Pro, Kranj and Računalniške novice, as well as the broader IPM group that helped us realize this project within IPM Digital. I'd like to thank all the viewers for actively listening to both the main event, subsequent panel discussions, and this closing discussion. And I'd like to just emphasize to all of the viewers that if you want to digitalize any aspect of your organization, business, or you as an individual, you can come into contact with us at IPM Group, and we will map out the digital future of your organization. Thank you for your attention, and I wish you a good, sunny, and delightful end of the day.